Everyone told him it was suicide. The desert would kill his entire army before they even reached the enemy. But this general did it anyway, and what happened next shocked the entire world. December 1940. North Africa. The British Empire is on the verge of collapse. Italian forces outnumber them 5-1. Everyone expects a massacre. London is preparing for defeat. But there's one man who sees an opportunity where everyone else sees disaster. His name is General Richard O'Connor. And this is the story of how one brilliant plan turned 30,000 men into an unstoppable force that destroyed an army of 150,000 and changed the course of the entire war. Let me set the scene for you so you understand just how impossible this situation looked. It's 1940. Britain is barely hanging on. France has fallen. The Nazis control most of Europe. Britain stands alone. And now Mussolini, the Italian dictator, has decided this is his moment to grab glory and territory in North Africa. Italy has a massive army in Libya. Over 150,000 men. They have tanks, artillery, air support, and fortified positions. They've been preparing for months. Their commander, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, is cautious, but he has overwhelming numbers. He doesn't need to be brilliant. He just needs to not mess up. Facing this huge Italian force is the Western Desert Force. That's the fancy name for Britain's army in Egypt. But calling it an army is generous. It's barely 30,000 men. They're spread thin across hundreds of miles of desert. They have limited supplies, old equipment, and almost no reinforcements coming. Everyone in London assumes Egypt will fall. They're already planning for it. Winston Churchill is furious, but there's not much he can do. Britain is fighting for survival at home. The Blitz is hammering London every night. German invasion seems possible any day. There's simply nothing to spare for North Africa. But here's where Richard O'Connor enters the story. O'Connor was not your typical British general. Most British officers at the time came from wealthy families. They went to fancy schools. They had connections and polish. O'Connor didn't fit that mold. He was middle class, quiet. Some people thought he was shy. He didn't play the political games that other officers played. What O'Connor had was a mind that worked differently than everyone else's. While other generals saw problems, O'Connor saw patterns. While others worried about what they didn't have, O'Connor focused on what he did have. While others planned cautiously, O'Connor planned aggressively. In September 1940, the Italians invaded Egypt. Graziani moved slowly, carefully. He captured some territory and then stopped. He built a chain of fortified camps stretching across the desert. Each camp was supposed to support the others. The plan was solid. Defensive. Safe. Graziani had learned his lesson from previous campaigns. He wasn't going to rush. He wasn't going to take risks. He'd advance slowly, consolidate, and let his superior numbers do the work. But there was a problem with Graziani's plan that he didn't see. Those fortified camps were spread far apart, miles apart, in the desert. And the desert is huge and empty. You can't watch every inch of sand between camps. There are gaps, lots of gaps. O'Connor saw those gaps. In December 1940, O'Connor proposed something that sounded absolutely crazy. He wanted to attack, not just raid or harass. A full attack, with his tiny force against an enemy 5 times larger. His superiors thought he'd lost his mind. Attack? With what? The British were outnumbered in men, tanks, planes, and artillery. Attacking was suicide. The logical thing to do was defend, hold on as long as possible, and hope for reinforcements that probably weren't coming. But O'Connor explained his plan, and slowly, people started to understand. He wasn't planning a head-on attack. He wasn't going to march up to Italian positions and start shooting. That would be suicide. Instead, O'Connor had studied the Italian positions carefully. He'd sent out patrols for months. He knew where every Italian camp was located. He knew the distances between them. He knew which camps had better defenses and which were weaker. He knew the Italian supply routes. He knew their patrol patterns. And he'd found a weakness. The gap between the Italian camps near Sidi Barani was wider than the others. Wide enough that a force could slip through at night without being detected. If the British could get through that gap, they could hit the Italian camps from behind, from the direction the Italians weren't expecting. The Italians had built their defenses facing east, toward Egypt. They expected attacks from that direction. But what if the attack came from the west, from behind their own lines? That was O'Connor's plan. A wide sweeping move through the desert, behind Italian positions, attacking from the rear. But there was one massive problem: the terrain. To get behind the Italian lines, O'Connor's forces would have to cross a stretch of desert that was considered impassable. It wasn't sand dunes like in movies. It was worse. It was rocky, broken ground with steep ridges and hidden ravines. No roads, no water, no landmarks, just endless miles of hostile terrain. Military experts said you couldn't move an army across that ground. Trucks would break down. Tanks would get stuck. Men would get lost. Supply lines would be impossible to maintain. It was too far, too rough, too dangerous. O'Connor disagreed. O'Connor spent weeks preparing for this attack, not making speeches or holding meetings, actually preparing, getting into the details that would make or break the entire operation. First, he needed to solve the navigation problem. How do you move thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, and dozens of tanks across featureless desert at night without getting lost? O'Connor brought in experts. He found officers who'd worked in the desert before. He talked to locals who knew the terrain. He studied maps until he had them memorized. And then he came up with a system. The British would use the stars to navigate. Ancient sailors used stars. Why not armies? O'Connor trained his officers in celestial navigation. Every commander learned how to find north using the stars. They practiced until they could do it instantly, even under stress. But stars aren't enough when you're moving at night in a convoy. You need more. So O'Connor established a system of guide vehicles. Experienced drivers who knew the desert would lead each column. Other vehicles would follow their lights. Nobody breaks formation. Nobody wanders off. He also used compasses. Every vehicle got a compass. Officers were trained to dead reckon, calculating position based on direction and distance traveled. It sounds simple, but in practice it's incredibly difficult. In the dark, on rough ground, with dust everywhere, keeping track of your position is nearly impossible. O'Connor drilled his men on this until it became automatic. They practiced night movements over and over. Short movements at first, then longer ones, building confidence and skill. Then there was the logistics problem. An army needs supplies. Food, water, ammunition, fuel. Lots of fuel. Tanks and trucks drink fuel like crazy. And O'Connor was planning to move his army deep into the desert, far from supply bases. So O'Connor set up forward supply dumps. Secret stockpiles of fuel and ammunition hidden in the desert. His men spent weeks moving supplies forward, a little at a time, so the Italians wouldn't notice. They buried fuel drums in the sand. They camouflaged ammunition caches. They marked these hidden dumps with coordinates that only British officers knew. This way, when the attack began, O'Connor's forces could refuel and rearm from these hidden dumps instead of having to run supply convoys all the way back to Egypt. It was brilliant, and it was the kind of detail that most generals would overlook. O'Connor also had to think about his tanks. The British had some good tanks, like the Matilda infantry tank, heavily armored. The Italian anti-tank guns couldn't hurt them, but the Matildas were slow and there weren't many of them. O'Connor also had cruiser tanks, which were faster but more lightly armored. He decided to use them differently. The Matildas would lead attacks on fortified positions. Their armor would protect them. The cruiser tanks would exploit breakthroughs and chase retreating enemies. Speed and armor used together, not separately. This sounds obvious now, But in 1940, it was innovative thinking. Most generals used tanks as infantry support, moving slowly with foot soldiers. O'Connor saw tanks as breakthrough weapons that could move independently. He also had to deal with the reality that his forces were massively outnumbered. 5-to-1 odds are terrible. In a straight fight, the British would lose. So O'Connor couldn't allow straight fights. His plan relied on surprise, speed, and confusion. Hit the Italians before they knew what was happening. Hit them where they weren't ready. Keep moving so fast that they couldn't organize a response. Make them think the British force was larger than it actually was. To create confusion, O'Connor planned to attack multiple Italian camps simultaneously. Not one big attack. Multiple smaller attacks happening all at once. This would prevent the Italians from concentrating their forces. They'd have to defend everywhere, which meant they'd be weak everywhere. But coordinating simultaneous attacks across miles of desert, at night, with limited communications, is incredibly difficult. Radio equipment in 1940 was primitive, unreliable. Ranges were short. Batteries died. Sand got into everything. O'Connor established a communications plan that didn't rely solely on radios. He used messengers, motorcycle riders who could carry orders between units. He set up visual signals. Flares of different colors meant different things. He established fallback plans. If communications failed, each unit knew what to do based on the original orders. Everything was planned down to the minute. Which unit would attack which camp? What time attacks would begin? Where reserves would be positioned? How retreating Italians would be pursued? Routes for supply convoys. Locations for medical stations. Positions for artillery support. O'Connor's staff worked around the clock preparing orders, maps, and briefings. Every officer in the force was briefed personally by O'Connor or his senior staff. Everyone knew the plan. Everyone knew their role. But O'Connor did something else that was crucial. He kept the plan secret. The Italian forces had spies. Information leaked. O'Connor knew this. So he limited who knew about the attack. Only senior officers got the full picture. Lower ranks were told only what they needed to know. The rank-and-file soldiers didn't learn they were attacking until the day before. O'Connor even deceived his own side. He told Cairo that he was planning a large raid. Not an attack, just a raid to disrupt the Italians. This way, if information leaked, the Italians would prepare for a raid, not a major offensive. The deception worked. The Italians had no idea what was coming. On December 7, 1940, the Western Desert Force began its movement. Under cover of darkness, thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles rolled into the desert. They were heading into terrain that military experts said was impassable. The first night was rough. Vehicles broke down. Some units got temporarily lost. The rocky ground was even worse than expected. But O'Connor's planning paid off. The navigation system worked. The guide vehicles kept columns on track. When vehicles broke down, recovery crews were positioned to fix them or tow them. The British force moved slowly but steadily through that impossible desert. Mile after mile, hour after hour, all through the night. And the Italians didn't see them, didn't hear them, had no idea they were coming. By dawn on December 8th, O'Connor's force was in position behind Italian lines, right where he wanted them. Climax/key moment. The attack began at first light on December 9th, 1940. Multiple Italian camps were hit simultaneously. The Italians were eating breakfast, getting ready for another boring day of garrison duty. They thought they were safe behind their defenses. Then British tanks appeared from the west, from behind them, from the direction of their own supply lines. The confusion was total. Italian soldiers couldn't understand what was happening. How were British tanks behind them? That was impossible. The desert was impassable. Everyone knew that. But there they were. Matilda tanks rolling forward, impervious to Italian anti-tank fire. Infantry following up. Artillery pounding Italian positions. Camp after camp fell within hours. The Italians tried to fight, but they were completely unprepared for attacks from behind. Their guns pointed the wrong way. Their defenses were backwards. Everything was wrong. At Nabewa camp, the first position hit. The Italians collapsed in less than 2 hours. Thousands surrendered. The camp commander was killed while trying to organize a defense. At Tummer camps, the pattern repeated. Sudden attack from an unexpected direction. Brief, confused fighting. Then surrender. The Italian chain of command fell apart. Officers couldn't contact their headquarters. Headquarters couldn't figure out what was happening. Reports came in of attacks everywhere. Nothing made sense. O'Connor kept the pressure on. He didn't stop to consolidate. Didn't pause to count prisoners. His forces kept moving. Hit one camp, then roll to the next one. Keep the Italians confused and retreating. The Italian commander, General Maletti, died trying to defend Nabewa. His death demoralized Italian troops further. Other Italian generals started ordering retreats without authorization from Graziani. Within 3 days, O'Connor's tiny force had destroyed multiple Italian divisions. Thousands of Italian soldiers were dead or captured. Huge amounts of equipment were captured. Tanks, artillery, trucks, supplies. The British suddenly had more equipment than when they started because they were capturing Italian gear faster than they lost their own. Graziani was in a panic. His reports to Rome made no sense. He claimed he was being attacked by massive British forces with overwhelming numbers. He said the British had secret weapons. He couldn't explain how a smaller British force was destroying his army. Mussolini was furious. He'd promised Hitler that Italy would conquer Egypt. Now his army was collapsing. He demanded that Graziani stop the British advance. But Graziani had lost control of the situation. His army was retreating in chaos. Units were surrendering without fighting. Morale was gone. The Italian soldiers no longer believed they could win. O'Connor saw the Italian collapse and made a decision that changed everything. He decided to pursue. Most generals would have stopped after the initial success. Consolidated. Regrouped. Waited for orders from higher command. Not O'Connor. He saw an opportunity to destroy the entire Italian army, not just defeat it. If he pursued aggressively, he could cut off the Italian retreat and trap them. But there was a problem. His supply lines were stretched to breaking. His men were exhausted. His equipment was worn out from days of constant combat and movement. Every military textbook said to pause and regroup. O'Connor ignored the textbooks. He pushed forward. He sent his fastest units racing ahead to cut the coast road at Beta Fam. This was the only route the retreating Italians could use. If the British blocked it, the entire Italian army would be trapped. It was a race. Could the British get to Beta Fam before the Italians escaped? O'Connor's force drove through the desert at maximum speed. Vehicles broke down and were abandoned. Men drove on fumes when fuel ran low. They lived on emergency rations. Nobody slept. The entire force was running on adrenaline and determination. On February 5, 1941, British forces reached Beta Fam just as the Italian army arrived. The road was blocked. The Italians tried to break through. They had more tanks than the British, more men, more equipment, but they were demoralized and disorganized. The British were exhausted but determined. The battle at Beta Fam lasted 2 days. The Italians threw everything they had at the British roadblock. Tank attacks, infantry assaults, artillery barrages. Nothing worked. The British line held by the thinnest margin. At some points, British soldiers were down to their last few rounds of ammunition. Tanks were running on empty, but they held. On February 7th, the Italian army surrendered. Not just a division, not just a corps, the entire Italian 10th Army. Over 130,000 men surrendered to a British force that numbered about 30,000. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. O'Connor's tiny force had advanced 500 miles in 2 months. They'd destroyed an army 5 times their size. They'd captured thousands of prisoners, hundreds of tanks, and vast quantities of supplies. British casualties were minimal, just over 500 killed and 1,400 wounded. The Italians had lost everything. What O'Connor accomplished in those 2 months changed the entire war in North Africa. He'd proven that the Italians could be beaten. He'd shown that aggressive action with inferior numbers could succeed if you planned it right. But here's what makes O'Connor's achievement even more remarkable. He did it all on a shoestring. He had no advantages, no secret weapons, no overwhelming air power, no unlimited supplies. He just had a plan and the determination to execute it. The plan worked because O'Connor thought through every detail. The navigation problem, the supply problem, the coordination problem, the deception problem. He didn't overlook anything. He also understood his enemy. He knew the Italians had poor morale. He knew their commanders were cautious. He knew their defensive positions had weaknesses. He exploited all of it. Most importantly, O'Connor understood timing. He knew when to attack, when to push, and when to take risks. After the initial success, a cautious general would have stopped. O'Connor pushed forward because he recognized that the Italian army was broken. One more shove would finish them. That decision to pursue, to race to Beta Fam despite all the risks, that's what turned a victory into a legendary triumph. The tragedy is what happened next. O'Connor wanted to keep going. Libya was wide open. He could have pushed all the way to Tripoli and kicked Italy completely out of North Africa. The war in Africa might have ended in early 1941, but Churchill ordered him to stop. British forces were needed in Greece. Politics and strategy pulled resources away from North Africa just when O'Connor had the Italians beaten. 2 months later, a German general named Erwin Rommel arrived in North Africa with the Afrika Korps. The war in the desert would drag on for 2 more years. And in April 1941, O'Connor was captured during a reconnaissance mission. He spent the rest of the war in Italian prison camps. By the time he was freed in 1943, the war in North Africa was over. Other generals had gotten the glory for finishing what O'Connor started. But military historians know the truth. O'Connor's Operation Compass was one of the most brilliant campaigns of World War II. Against impossible odds, with limited resources, O'Connor used planning, deception, and aggressive execution to achieve total victory. He proved that genius isn't about having the most resources. It's about using what you have in the smartest way possible. It's about seeing opportunities that others miss. It's about having the courage to take calculated risks. The desert that everyone said was impassable, O'Connor crossed it. The Italian army that everyone said was too big to defeat, O'Connor destroyed it. The defensive positions that everyone said were too strong to attack, O'Connor bypassed them. He did it all with careful planning, with attention to detail, with a clear understanding of what was possible and what wasn't, and with the determination to execute the plan no matter how hard it got. Years after the war, military academies started teaching O'Connor's campaign. They studied his navigation techniques, his supply arrangements, his deception methods, his pursuit strategy. All of it became textbook material for how to win when you're outnumbered. O'Connor himself remained humble about his achievement. When asked how he beat an army 5 times larger, he said something simple. We planned carefully, we moved at night, and we hit them where they weren't ready. The Italians did the rest by panicking. That was typical O'Connor, understating his genius, giving credit to others, not seeking glory. But the facts speak for themselves. In 2 months, with 30,000 men, O'Connor captured 130,000 enemy soldiers, destroyed 400 tanks, and advanced 500 miles. No amount of modesty can hide how incredible that achievement was. The general they doubted became the man who proved that smart planning beats superior numbers. The campaign they said was impossible became one of the greatest victories in British military history. The desert they said couldn't be crossed became the road to total victory. That's what great planning looks like. That's what happens when genius meets determination. That's the power of refusing to accept what everyone else says is impossible. Check out the next video for another incredible general story.